And now for Unit 2. Unit 2 is all about an ancient civilization called Mesopotamia. Before we actually get into that specific city, though, I want to kind of take a step back and explain to you that there are four ancient river valley civilizations that kind of started the entire world. They are Mesopotamia, which is the one we're about to discuss, Egypt, India, and China. So all four will develop in what we call river valleys. So you have to have water. So this is the greatest place for them to start out, and without the water, they wouldn't be the giant successes that they became. So river valleys, because they have to have a river. So ancient river valley civilizations is the name that they go by. They're also called cradles of civilization because it is where real civilization began in all four places, and you see them on the map here. So they're not neighbors to one another. They just arise because the conditions geographically were good, and they had a stable place and could thrive. So we're going to start with Mesopotamia because to me it's the one that's most complicated. It changes hands quite often, and we'll get into why in just a minute. But let's define what civilization actually is before we get into Mesopotamia. So we're going to do a general overview of what civilization actually is. So right now I'm talking about all four of these ancient river valley civilizations: Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and China. So each of these four places that we're going to characterize as the first four real civilizations across the planet each had advanced cities. And that doesn't just mean that they have a permanent city. We know that they started having permanent homes in the year 8000 BC because of agriculture. So that's one thing, but that's not enough. In order to be considered an advanced city, not only does it have to be a permanent city, but it has to have permanent trade lines. So, a way to constantly be bringing goods in and sending goods out. So, trade is really important in order for it to be considered an advanced city. So, permanent location and permanent trade routines. They also have to have specialized workers and layers. So you have to have people that know how to build, how to later blacksmith, how to weave, how to do pottery. You have specialized workers. So in order to get things built and get things worked out, including laws and anything else you can think of that cities need, you have to have people that are experts in their field. And so that's what you have to have in order to have a real civilization. And layers, you really have to have that. I mean, you've got to have somebody in charge to say, hey, this is the thing we're going to do next. Go get Bob. Bob is the one who is the expert. But you have to have somebody directing those experts and delegating responsibility. So you definitely have to have that to have a civilization. The third thing is complex institutions, and that goes back to the government. You have to have a organized government. You can't have one that's willy nilly, and they maybe you don't like Bob, and so Bob gets punished for things he didn't do all the time. You can't have that. Religion will also be a part of that. Now, it's not as complex in these early civilizations as it will become later, but a system of faith, let's just say that, instead of actual religion, a system of faith, something that everyone agrees on. So these complex institutions, both, whether you're talking about religion or you're talking about a political arena, both of these are things that everyone that lives in that city agrees on. They agreed to abide by it or believe in it, and that makes them a cohesive group and lends to the fact that they can be a civilization. You also have to have record keeping of some sort. So it's not the writing like we tend to think of in modern times. It could just be pictures. It could be knots on a rope, like the Incans did. It can be anything, but it has to be some sort of record keeping. That could also be oral. So there may be places across the planet that we didn't think kept records, but they did. They just did it in an oral fashion. But the fact that they were counting crops, counting people, counting homes, that matters because that goes back to that complex institutions that they are aware that, hey, okay, we have 10 people now, we need enough food and water for 10 people. Oh, now we have 100, we need enough food and water for that. So record keeping is very important. And then the last one is advanced technology. In a civilization, you have to constantly be moving forward. So those specialized workers are going to use technology and keep improving on the technology to make people's lives easier, to make their civilization better, more protected. And it could be something as simple as learning how to make better bricks. So we talked about how fascinating it was that Catahoyuk, the people of Catahoyuk knew how to make bricks because it's really hard to make bricks. It's an extremely labor intensive activity. But those brick makers, as they got more familiar with it, found ways to cut corners, and so it was less time, but their product was even better in the end. So brick making is a form of technology in this time period. So you have to have all five of these to be considered a civilization. So Catahoyuk was missing a few. There's some holes there. We don't have the record keeping. We're not real sure about the specialized workers, or we know that they had some type of government because it was so organized, but without the record keeping, we're just not really sure that they had everything to qualify them as an actual civilization. So we're knocking them out of the ballpark. We could be totally wrong, but we're knocking them out of the ballpark, and we're going to focus on just the four places that are characterized as the start of civilization or the cradle of civilization. All right, so what contributions did these first four places make? Social, political, and economic. So, in the social realm, they created the idea of hereditary rulers. And of course, in this time period, and for many, many, many time periods after that, it will most often be father to son. So, they're related, hereditary, they're related. Sometimes you might have female rulers have to take over because certain situations allowed it to happen, but that's still really rare. Sorry, ladies, that doesn't happen for quite some time. You also have to have a class system. And as awful as that sounds, that they created a class system, it really was a necessary evil at the time. So people were not going to just volunteer to go work in the fields or make those god awful bricks. They weren't just going to volunteer to do that because it was the joy of their life. You had to have a means to force people to do these things. And so in this class system, you always have a group of slaves. Now, it's not the slaves like we think of during our horrible American past when we practiced African slavery. It's not like that. Usually, slaves were made up of a group of people who had done something wrong and this was their punishment, or maybe they owed money that they couldn't pay back. That's the kind of people that were slaves. It wasn't people being actually held in bondage. They went home after their daily duty, and it wasn't a life sentence. It was just, you were finishing something or fixing something, and you had to be a slave to get that done. So but the class system is really important because throughout history we're going to have those smaller people, the lower level people, that really we build nations on the backs of these people, as awful as it is. So you got to have a class system. This class system also allows for somebody to be in charge, so it's pretty important. Now, the political contributions, this is when we start deciding terms for groups, whether they are an empire, a kingdom, a city state. All of these names start to become the norm for these groups. So they start naming themselves and categorizing themselves according to how big they are, how much land and people do they control. So the words that we use now, kingdom, empire, etc., are words that these ancient civilizations came up with. And so it is the foundation of these political entities, even as something as simple as a town. What qualifies it to be a town? What do you have to be a town? And how big do you have to be to go from being a town to a city? It's these ancient people that are going to come up with these rules, and we still abide by most of them today. They also came up with forms of control over their citizens, laws. The first laws ever made in the world are going to be started in these four ancient river valley civilizations. And when I say ancient, I mean ancient. And we still use those same forms of control over citizens, whether it's law, whether it's fear in cases like Stalin and Lenin and men like that. Whatever kind of form of control you can think of, these guys started it, good or bad. And then we have economic progress. For the first time ever, they're going to end up with a surplus, an agricultural surplus, which allows trade to happen. And remember, you have to have permanent patterns of trade to be qualified as a civilization, but you can't have that without a surplus. So their technology had gotten far enough advanced that they were not only making enough food for their people and goods for their people, but they were making a surplus and can finally open up permanent trade lines between themselves and their neighbors. And so they finally will qualify as an actual civilization. All right, so again, why are they called river valley civilizations? Well, here's some pictures to help you figure that out. All right, so look at Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is unique in that it actually had two rivers that these people depended on, the Tigris and the Euphrates, and you can see in the picture here. Now, the rivers really do control life in these river valley civilizations. If the river dries up, there is not going to be any life, and there's not going to be any crops, there's not going to be anything. So they are very dependent on these rivers. So the Tigris and Euphrates, very, very, very important to the people of Mesopotamia. Now, Egypt, the Nile River is their major river, and this river is actually controlling the people much more than the Tigris and Euphrates rivers do. The Nile flooded on a pretty regular basis, and so the people that lived along the Nile and used that as their water source had to kind of obey whatever the river wanted them to do. When it was time for the river to overflow, the people had to work around that, move their things, learn to make crops that would not be destroyed with the flood. So living along the Nile River really did make a difference in these people's lives. So you need to be able to match the river with the civilization. So Mesopotamia has Tigris and Euphrates, and the Egyptians have the Nile River. The Indian River Valley civilization was controlled by the Indus River. That one's pretty easy, Indian, Indus. And then the Chinese had a kind of crazy river. We're going to talk a lot about that when we get to China. But their river that they're dependent on is the Huanghe River, also known as the Yellow River. I know you can't see it really good in this picture, but it actually does look yellow. And we'll get to why when we actually start talking about China. So why are these places developing in river valleys? There's two major reasons. Okay, it's not just a water source. We've talked about that. But even more than a water source, I mean, they could have found like a little creek, instead of an actual raging river. But there's two things that they are going to find along these rivers in the river valley, and that is really good soil, so that they can grow tons of crops and get that surplus to be qualified as a civilization. And it also offers them protection. So if you are right alongside a river, it's going to be really hard for somebody to cross that river unnoticed to get to you to invade you. They got to worry about invasion in this time period. So if you've got that water source on one side, you only really have to worry about the other side. And it cuts your need for protection and guards by half. That's a big deal, especially in these smaller civilizations. So top two reasons that they developed along the river is that fertile soil and protection from enemies. So Mesopotamia, again, owes its prosperity to the Tigris and Euphrates. It is, though, the only river valley civilization that constantly changes hands from one empire to the next. And we're going to go through each one of the more important empires. Okay, so why does it change hands constantly? It changes hands constantly because of the way that it's laid out. It is actually very, very flat. It's very easy to invade compared to the other places. Yes, you have to get across the Tigris or the Euphrates, depending on which way you're coming in, but there's no hills and mountains to protect this group of people. Or there's no desert to protect them. So they are pretty much wide open once you get across one of these rivers, the Tigris or Euphrates, and so it makes them much easier to invade than the other three civilizations that we're going to talk about. So just know, if you were asked on a test which of the four was the most easily invaded or the one that changed hands the most often, know that it is Mesopotamia. All right, so geography matters. It absolutely matters. If you don't have the mountains, the deserts, the rivers to surround you, you're open for conquest. All right, so there are lots of empires and civilizations, like I said, of Mesopotamia and the surrounding area. So we're going to take it as slow as we need to take it for everybody to understand. You can replay this video a million times if you need to. So let's kind of get an idea of where actually Mesopotamia was. It was in that Fertile Crescent area where Aleppo and Jericho was. So you can see here on the map, you might recognize the more modern names of like Iran, that kind of area. But it's very, very, very fertile, and many people believe that the if the Garden of Eden truly existed, that's where it was because it is so, so fertile. So Mesopotamia is in the Fertile Crescent. And here's just a wider picture of it so you can see the Black Sea, Mediterranean, Turkey's there. It kind of gives you an idea of where it is in a larger scale. Now, don't forget about the two rivers that control it, the Tigris and Euphrates, and you see that Fertile Crescent from the Persian Gulf all the way over to the Mediterranean. So it's kind of connecting those two water sources. And in a very large scale, here's that map I've already shown you in a little bit bigger form. So we are talking about Mesopotamia, the one most farther, most north. Okay. All right, so it is very, very complicated. We're going to start with baby steps. It's nicknamed the Fertile Crescent. We've talked about that because it was a place where practically anything would grow, and it truly is shaped like a crescent. Make sure you know it connects the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean Sea, and later we'll get into the Nile. It connects to the Nile too. So it connects water sources, this Fertile Crescent, and all the land in between is exactly what the name says, fertile, and it's shaped like a crescent. So that's pretty simple. This is also called the Tigris-Euphrates Valley because you've got those two rivers that are controlling the area and helping them to survive at the same time. So we're going to talk about some major cities, the cities of Sumer, Babylonia, and Assyria, and we will get to those in a minute. So don't get too freaked out. We'll get to that in a minute. We're also going to look at the location of the Hittites in the original home of the Hebrews. And it is also entwined with Persians and Phoenicians. So if I haven't blown your mind yet, I hope you're still holding in there with me. You don't need to know all these right this second. I'm trying to introduce to you how complicated it can be. But I hope that I make it seem a little more simplified. So there are very blurred boundary lines between all these different groups. One comes in to take another over. Sometimes they're living there intertwined. So I'm going to try and unblur those boundary lines a little bit. All right, so let's take a step back and look at all these cities one at a time and what each one was like. Okay, so this is a time of progress. So as Sumer is taken over by Babylonia and so on, each group is going to be more advanced than the next. Or sorry, than the previous. That wouldn't make any sense at all, would it? Than the previous one. There you go. All right, so let's look at the Sumerian civilization, also known as Sumer. Sumer is actually a city in the Fertile Crescent, and here's your years. So when I said ancient, I meant it. So 33,000 years, 3,300 years before the birth of Christ. And they're going to last about 1,000 years. So you don't have to memorize the years. I just want you to be able in your mind to say, oh my gosh, that was more than 3,000 years before the birth of Christ. That was a long time ago. All right, so their government is a city-state. This is the very first city-state in the world. So this was the first time ever that people worried about land ownership. They started to say for the first time, this is mine, that is yours, and we're not going to share anymore. So very first city-states ever. Today, I guess to help you kind of put together what a city-state is in your mind, because it's not a word we use very often anymore. To us here in America, it would actually be just like a state. So a city-state is a fancy word to just say state, like Virginia, West Virginia, that kind of thing. All right, so the city-states are ruled by kings. and it is passed down through heredity. So this very first city is the first one to use the hereditary system, and it was believed that the family that the bloodline runs through was originally chosen by the gods. So we don't know exactly how the very first family was chosen. We just know from records that were kept that that is what people believe, that this family was handpicked by the gods. All right, so here's what Sumer looks like. Kind of cool. Lots of walls. Higher up, they tried to plateau it. It's an. I wish I had a better picture, but this is what we got. So there you go. All right, so they had a very rigid class system, and slavery was part of their class system. As I said, you got to build your city on the backs of somebody, as awful as that is, but that's the way it is. So at the top, you have this group: kings, nobles, and high priests. Okay, so you might have to slow the video down or pause it to write these. You do have to know the layers. You are going to be asked about that on the test. The second layer is the lower priest, merchants, and scholars, which means they were educated. Woo. Peasant farmers are there on the third rung, and I'm pretty sure you can guess who is there at the bottom. Slaves. So again, these slaves may be people who had committed a crime, they owe a debt, and here's a new thing: they could have been kidnapped or captured in war, and this is like they're prisoners of war kind of thing. But still, no one owns them. They don't live in shackles. It's a totally different type of slavery than what we know in American history. All right, so your class membership decided where you lived in the city state. In the center of the town, they had something called a ziggurat, and it was a temple. It was considered to be the home of the gods, and I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. And again, it stood in the center of the city. The more important you were class-wise, the closer you were allowed to live in the ziggurat or to the ziggurat. So the majority of people who farmed and worked on irrigation, they lived on the outskirts, and they would have anyway because you wouldn't have the farm close to the ziggurat. So the whole thing made sense that you would have the most important people live closest to the holiest part of town, and you would have the people who really need to be on the outside because they're farming live the farthest away, and they're less important, right? Even though they're making all the food. To me, that makes no sense. But anyway, the more important you are, the closer you live to the ziggurat, and the farmers would be out on the outskirts with the slaves living on those farms as well, or on around the farms, not on them. All right, so here's what a ziggurat looks like. This big square building with the stairs. You could fit a whole lot of people in there, and it was the priest's job to visit the ziggurat on a daily basis and kind of commune with the gods in there and let the king and the other priests know what the gods said and what they need and what they demand. So it was believed that the priest could actually commune with the gods in that building. Here's a better view of Sumer, and you can see the ziggurat there in the middle. Huge, huge building. And here is a much better picture of a ziggurat. Square building made with bricks, much better type of bricks than you would have found in Catahoyuk. All right, so let's talk about Sumer's economy. They are an agrarian society, which means they were farmers. They were the first ever to control the waters of the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, and they used that control to create irrigation canals. And they built those canals and controlled the river through dams. So this is all brand new technology. Irrigation and the building of dams and the irrigation canals are all brand new technology. Nobody had ever controlled a river before. Nobody had ever figured out a way to make the river water the gardens without having to haul buckets and buckets of water. So irrigation and the irrigation canals are going to do this for these people, makes farming so much easier. They developed much better tools and plows. And this is the first time, again, that they're going to have agricultural surplus because they do have better tools and plows. They do have irrigation. They've learned to control the rivers to help them instead of just flooding them. So this is a really big deal. Sumer is the place to be. It's the hot spot on the planet. Food surplus allowed the Sumerians to do other things, to focus on things that didn't have anything to do with survival, like art. And so you get this very specialization of labor, very specialized. So now instead of being an artist who spends most of his day farming because you have to feed your family, the whole city state has a surplus. And so now if you can make money as an artist, you can just go buy food from somebody else. You don't have to grow it yourself. So you have for the first time the people who are the potters and the basket weavers and whatever other kind of artisan you can think of. So brand new jobs emerge in Sumer because of this new development in farming and making things so much easier to have a surplus. All right, so they were polytheistic, which means they had many gods. And these are the first people ever to have what we consider to be a real writing system. A thing called pictographs already was around, and that is using pictures to get your ideas across. So that began about 5000 BC. But the Sumerians are actually going to create a writing system, and that writing system is known as cuneiform. So it was done by pressing symbols into wet clay, and they had a lot of symbols, about 1200. So way more complicated than any modern alphabet that we can think of. And remember, it's done in shapes. It's not letters, it's shapes. Okay, so you went from pictographs with the Neolithic people, and now you have cuneiform with the Sumerians. And here's what cuneiform looks like. So you see it's all these different kinds of wedges, right? Very different from what we're used to. Here's a better picture of cuneiform. The interesting thing about cuneiform, it is very difficult, but they weren't big on letting little children learn how to do this. You had to kind of be selected. You had to be special to learn how to do cuneiform. Girls were not allowed to be able to do it, and only about 1% of the boys in the population were allowed to be taught how to do cuneiform. So being able to write meant that you were probably from a pretty powerful family, or maybe somebody identified you as like this super smart person, but you had to be special by some way in order to be allowed to learn it. 1% of the boys' male population was allowed to learn it. All right, so they also developed the very first arch in buildings. They designed the ziggurats. We've already talked about that. They did it by baking bricks and placing them in layers. Much more uniform, much more aesthetically beautiful than what you would have found in Catahoyuk. They might have been the first to develop and use the wheel. We're not absolutely positive, but they might have been. So I'm going to put a link here, if I haven't already, so that you can see a video of the Sumerians, and it'll give you an idea, just to reiterate some of the things that they were capable of way back 3,000 years before the birth of Christ. So take a minute. I know it's a pain in the butt to have to put this in your browser, but type it in there for me, watch the video, and then come on back and we'll do some more notes, because I know you love that. One of the things I wanted to make sure that you got out of that video was the fact that in the city of Ur, which was a Sumerian city, that is supposedly the home of Abraham. Abraham, who is the father of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. So pretty important place, and it was a Sumerian place. Hopefully you did like I asked you to do, and you watched the video. If you didn't, please go back and do it, because there are facts in there that I did not include in the lecture because I wanted you to watch the film. I think the guy presents it really well and shows you the similarity between these ancient people and us. So there are some pretty important facts in that video. If you didn't watch it, go do it now. All right, so let's move on with what I want to tell you. The Sumerians gave us the first real literary work. If you watch the video, you know that they found multiple versions of poetry, and that's fantastic in itself. But they also created something called the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, This was not written down by the Sumerians. It was much too complicated, and you can see cuneiform is very, very complicated. So this Epic of Gilgamesh is considered the first real literary work. I mean, and it's huge. It's a very long story, very complicated, uses giant words. But the Epic of Gilgamesh is the story of a great flood that destroys the earth. So it is very, very similar to the version of the flood with Noah and the ark that we find in the Christian Bible. So it may be that this is the same story. Who knows? And this is, the Sumerians were the first ones to actually write about it. They remembered it orally for so long, and then they decided to somebody decided to actually turn it into an actual story. But like I said, they don't actually write it down. It was a story that was told orally over and over and over again till the people had it memorized. So, but it is the first real literary work, written or not. Okay, and it was done by the Sumerians. All right, so around 1800 BC, there is a pretty powerful group known as the Babylonians who will come in and conquer the Sumerians. Now, we've made it sound up to this point like the Sumerians had the perfect life. Well, they did when things were, on an even keel. But we've also talked about the fact that it was very easy to take this city over. They didn't have a lot of protection. There were no deserts surrounding them or mountain ranges. It was just those two rivers. So they were taken over quite often, and for about 500 years they were constantly in battle with people who would take them over temporarily, and then the Sumerians would fight them and reconquer their city. And so after 500 years of that, they're tired. And this group of Babylonians come along and they conquer the Sumerians forever and forever. Now, are the Sumerians gone? Like, do they kill them all? Do they run them all off? No. They just absorb them into their civilization. So the Sumerians are still there. They're just now called Babylonians. So all of the culture that was there with the Sumerians is going to remain, and then the Babylonians are going to add to it. And the first thing I want you to know that they added to was they actually wrote down the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's how we still have it today. It was the Babylonians who wrote it. They used the cuneiform that they learned from the Sumerians, and they actually wrote down the story of Gilgamesh, so it was no longer just an oral story. That's a big deal. That's a really big deal, because that's the only reason we probably still have that story. All right, so somewhere along the line, they took that idea of the 60 seconds and they incorporated it into their world and started basing many things on that 60, 120, 180. Hopefully you math people know what I'm talking about. If you didn't watch the video, you don't know what I'm talking about for the number 60 right now. So go watch the video if you have not. In 1792, there is going to be a very powerful man take over for the Babylonians named Hammurabi. Now, Hammurabi was a very strong political leader. He had an iron fist as a lawmaker, and he was not a man to be messed with at all. So he is best known for a code of laws he created that became known as the Code of Hammurabi, and it contained exactly 282 laws. Make sure you know that number, 282. It's going to be pretty significant later. There is a video here that I would like for you to watch as well. So if you would please pause, again, type this into your browser, and we will talk again in a few minutes. All right, so if you watched that video, wow, that is truly, truly some different ways of looking at stuff. So anyway, the importance of the Code of Hammurabi, I think the guy in the video did a really good job of like reining it back in and explaining, as gruesome as it is and as hardcore as it is, why it's important, that it really is the foundation of many laws or thoughts of laws that we still have today. We may not be as radical about the punishments, but it's things that need to be discussed and debated and decided on. All right, so the Code of Hammurabi is the first written code of law found intact. Are there other ones that date earlier? Yes, but they are not intact. We don't have enough pieces of the other ones to figure out what kind of law code it actually was, but the Code of Hammurabi is found completely intact. And again, like the guy in the video said, it concerned all parts of life, and he gave you a pretty good list. I hope you took notes on that video. If you didn't, please go back and do that. I know there weren't a lot of like hardcore, uh, like here's an actual fact kind of thing. He's kind of a little bit all over the place, but there are some very important things in there. And one of them is that it did concern all parts of life. It's not just laws about crops or laws about punishments for debt, which is what was the two top things, for people in this time period. It was everything. It from marital concerns to children. It was everything. All right, and it is totally based on the idea of eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. So if you cause someone harm, you're going to get harmed, and the punishment should be equal. I didn't see it as being equal. I mean, you're probably thinking that too after you watch that video, but that's the concept that Hammurabi was trying to portray. So punishment was harsh for everyone, but it was different between social classes. So there is a much more lenient code for people with power than for people with little or no power. Such as it's the same way today. I mean, if you can afford the best lawyer, you can pretty much do anything and get away with it. If you're poor like me, hey, I can't get out of a speeding ticket because I can't afford a good lawyer. So it really hasn't changed that much. Only now we're not killing people left and right like Hammurabi was, or poking out eyes or whatever, pulling teeth. All right, so here's a very good example of how it is different between a rich guy and a slave, perhaps. So if a man has destroyed the eye of a man of the gentleman class, they shall destroy his eye. But if he has destroyed the eye of a commoner, then he just has to pay some silver. If he's destroyed the eye of a gentleman's slave, he has to pay half the slave's price. So it goes right down the line from the rich to the lower class to the slave class. Very, very obviously playing favorites here. All right, so here's what it looks like. And he put these giant towers with the law codes on them all over Babylonia, so that if you ever had a doubt, like, hey, is what I'm doing illegal? If it is, what's my punishment going to be? All you had to do was go read one of these law towers. So they were everywhere, and so we have found them intact because there were so many of them. All right, so here's what it looks like at the top. And supposedly this is a god handing the laws to Hammurabi. So, like, even the gods are on board with this kind of mentality. And here's what it looks like up close. I mean, that is some serious writing. 282 laws on that tower. I mean, it's big, but still 282, and it's all those different layers for each one, layers of society. That is a lot of cuneiform in a very small space. As hardcore as this guy was, he is still very, very celebrated all over Europe, because he did create the first law code that concerned the little parts of life that other people hadn't thought about, like laws about marriage and children and beating your children and things like that. So this figure here on the left is supposed to be what Hammurabi looked like. It was actually found in some ruins, this what was left of a statue. In downtown Paris, there is a statue of Hammurabi holding a tablet of his code. So they still celebrate the guy. And this thing is massive, and it's downtown where all the political buildings are, right dead center in the middle of all those political buildings. So he is not celebrated as a tyrant that murdered people in the eye for an eye kind of mentality. He is seen as a political hero that built our legal world. Now, not long after Hammurabi died, there was a group known as the Hittites who were living in Turkey or Asia Minor or Anatolia, whichever one you want to call it. And they had discovered something called iron ore. And iron ore was much harder than wood, which is what weapons were made of at that time. And they learned how to make this iron ore a metal and use it to make weapons. So their weapons are much more fierce, much more sturdy, and can do a lot more damage. They also, on top of that, created a three-man chariot. So instead of having one guy driving the chariot and trying to take over the enemy or hurt people. Now you've got one guy controlling it, and you've got two men that can actually be fighting. So they created the very first axle that would allow for that much weight in a chariot, and it could actually be pulled by two horses. So it's a much bigger chariot, can go faster with the two horses, can carry more men, a really big deal. So the Hittites are going to take over the Babylonians. All right, so far we have the Sumerians who were taken over by the Babylonians, and then the Babylonians are going to be taken over by the Hittites. Told you this is really a lengthy, confusing group of people, one after another. Okay, so we've done three. We've got more to go. You ready? So the Hittites are not going to last very long. The Assyrians is a really vicious group in the same vicinity, around Mesopotamia, and they hear about the iron ore and these brand new weapons, and they steal that idea from the Hittites and just bury the Hittites in 1100 BCE. So they also stole the idea of the chariot along with it. They become a warlike society with a standing army of 40,000 men. That's the first time that we know of that there's actually a group with a standing army. That means they are ready to fight at a moment's notice, kind of thing. So basically a warfare society. What did they do with all the loot they got from these 40,000 standing soldiers? They built pretty things, believe it or not. So these great warriors loved beautiful things, and they built beautiful buildings, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute. The guy who really led it all, and made them super powerful, was a man by the name of Assurbanipal. Assurbanipal was an extremely violent man. He even would take his own family members out on the battlefield and behead them if they made him mad. And he would make them actually do it like on horseback, and they would fight one another. And of course, in the end, he would behead this person in front of everybody. He found out that his wife was having an affair, and he had a big fancy dinner as if he was going to celebrate his marriage. But what he'd really done is cut off the head of her lover, and he served it to her on a plate. And then later he kills her too. So Assurbanipal, a really, really wicked dude, but he loved beautiful things, and he thought that it was important that people be educated. And so Assurbanipal is going to create beautiful, beautiful libraries all over the Assyrian territory. And I'll show you some of those in a minute. He also believed that women should be kept separate, and they should have veils across their face. So women, even in the in the castle where he lived, women were quartered in a separate place from men so that they would not be a distraction, because it's a warfare society. They want the men to be able to fight at a moment's notice and not be distracted. And it was to the veils were meant to cover up the face of women, again, because of the distraction thing. So if a beautiful woman walks by when these men are trying to plot their next move, they would be distracted. Or if a really ugly woman, women just distract. And so even today in that part of the world, many women are forced to wear veils across their faces, and that started with the Assyrians, and in particular Assurbanipal. So people absolutely hate the Assyrians in that area, but it takes them 500 years to figure out how to get rid of them. But the Assyrians will be taken down by a second group of Babylonians. So a second Babylon is going to come along. Okay, so you have the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Hittites, the Assyrians, and now we're back to Babylonians again. So before we get into Babylon, the second Babylon, I want to show you a couple pictures concerning Assurbanipal and the Assyrians. All right, so this is what their city looked like. gorgeous, just absolutely gorgeous. This white limestone rock with all these minarets, just absolutely beautiful. If you go today and you look at the remnants of it, you can actually see his libraries, Assurbanipal's libraries. So he had 30,000 tablets, and they each had their own little cubby hole in the library, and there were actually some left when we uncovered it. There are many, many pictures of him hunting. It was like his favorite thing to do. This is supposedly on his wedding day, this picture at the bottom. And there's three heads in here. You'll have to look for them. But even on his wedding day, he had gone out that morning and slain some men who had betrayed him and used their heads as decoration at his wedding. So, yeah, he was a great guy. So we're going to talk about New Babylon now, and there are other leaders other than this guy, but he is the one who really made the New Babylon a force to be reckoned with. So we're going to focus on him. So Nebuchadnezzar II is the guy who really brought New Babylon to fruition, and he's going to rule for 43 years, and he makes it his goal to make sure that this city cannot be invaded. And so he built a fortress unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. And you don't have to memorize these measurements, but if you take a second to look at them, my gosh, it was impenetrable. And he didn't want people coming and going, so because of farming and stuff. So he actually made the Euphrates River flow right through the middle of the city. So they had the water source behind the walled part of the city, and so he could keep his people safe and keep the bad guys out. Now, he didn't want it to look like a fortress. He wanted it to be absolutely beautiful, and so it was. And you see here's some examples of the figures made of gold that he had scattered about the kingdom. So 50,000 pounds of solid gold for one statue. 18-foot high statue made of gold. Just crazy, crazy stuff. So knowing that, what do you think was important to the Babylonians? Of course, it's going to be money and wealth. So look at this city. You see all the floral mesh on the top of the building there? That's actually gardens. They actually grew gardens on top of the buildings, and these became known as the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And I said that really slow because I want you to write it down. So Nebuchadnezzar II is very famous for his hanging gardens. It's considered one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. So he used everything he could to grow food, but he also used the buildings, he also used the plants all over the buildings to make it beautiful, to get people to want to come and knock on the door of the fortress and be allowed in. So here's a better aerial view kind of picture. This one's drawn, but it does give you an idea of how lush these gardens were sitting on top of all these buildings. Now, the downfall to this, they did want people to come and see their city and spend money there so that the city could make more money. But because of that greed, they were allowing more and more people behind the walls of this fortress. And of course, that is going to be their downfall. They should never have opened the doors to outsiders. All right, so as wonderful as it was, because they kept opening the doors, Babylon II is actually exposed, and it will fall to attack by the Persians in 550 BCE. Okay, so New Babylon is dead, and the Persians take over. And the Persians will extend their empire in this darker brown color from Black Sea to Caspian Sea to Arabian Sea to Red Sea to Mediterranean Sea. Like, they have all of that. They've got all of that, just massive. It is the greatest empire of the time. So just a magnificent empire. So even beyond the Fertile Crescent, these guys take over everything. All right, so let's talk about the Persians. And again, they did not kill off the Babylonians, and just like the Hittites and the Assyrians and First Babylon and Sumerians, these people are all absorbed into the current empire, the current rule. So the Persian Empire is massive because they've incorporated all these people that they've taken over, and now they are citizens of the Persian Empire. Okay, so they were very tolerant of the people that they conquered. They allowed the conquered people to keep their own religion and their own laws, which is kind of unheard of. But they became known as like a loving kind of government, and people respected them. So to be taken over by the Persians wasn't always such a bad thing. They were well organized and tolerant. So they didn't come in and say, hey, starting today, you're not going to do this anymore. They didn't do it that way. So not a lot of people, common citizens, fought back. They created their first imperial bureaucracy. So let's take that word apart. Imperial means empire. So the Persian Empire qualifies as an empire because in order to be an empire, you have to be in control of a diverse population of peoples. So these Persians had taken over land that belonged to multiple cultures, and so they qualify as an empire because it's multiple cultures living there under their control now. So imperial just means empire. It was a place that was diverse enough to be qualified as an empire. Now, what's a bureaucracy? A bureaucracy is a government that has delegated different jobs to different people. So America has a very in-depth bureaucracy. We have people that deal with laws at every layer. We have people that are dealing with military. We have people that are dealing with the arts and humanities, and they're all political figures in D.C. making all these decisions that affect all of us. So that's a bureaucracy where you have different groups controlling specific needs in society or wants in society. So if you're this big as I showed you, that Persian Empire, they have to have a bureaucracy. There's no way that one little king can control it all. He has to have people that are out doing jobs for him and then letting him know what happened. So one guy can't do it all. He did send secret agents out. I'm saying that the emperor would send out secret agents throughout that giant empire just to make sure that things were okay and nobody's being corrupt and the rules that they did set are being followed and nobody's being persecuted for practicing their own religion or laws. And in order to keep the empire united, they had to have a road system. And so a very massive road system was created with 1,500 miles, and that became known as the Royal Road. And much of the Royal Road is still used today. So from 500 BC, they built this road that is still often used. That's pretty incredible, don't you think? Now, the Persian Empire had a very unique religion, and it was known as Zoroastrianism. It has that very odd long name because the guy who came up with it, his name was Zoroaster, so it's named after him. So, Zoroastrianism, he is the first individual that we know of to ever talk about, in religious terms, two opposing forces in the universe. And these two forces keep humans constantly in struggle between which one they should align with. So, and you could say like God versus the devil or good versus evil, however you want to look at it, but he is the first to say there's two opposing forces. He's also the first that we know of to mention the idea of a final judgment day where you will be judged according to how you lived and be sent to, we'll say, heaven or hell, but he's not using those words yet, but it's kind of the same idea. So look what he says. On this judgment day, all mankind will stand. In that assembly, everyone sees his own good and his own evil. And then in that assembly, the wicked man becomes as conspicuous as a white sheep among black. They will carry the righteous to the abode of harmony and cast the wicked back to a wicked existence. So you could think the harmony might be heaven, the wicked existence might be hell. But he's the first guy to ever come up with this kind of idea. All right, so we've talked about all these different people that have taken over one another. And Persians are the ones that we're going to kind of leave that takeover with, and we'll come back to the Persians in another unit. But now we need to talk about what neighbors are surrounding Mesopotamia. We've talked about trade. They've traded with a lot of people. Who are these people that they're trading with? but these people are not taking them over. There's two groups we're going to focus on. There's a lot more than that, but we're going to pick the two most two that affected them the most, and those would be the Phoenicians and the Hebrews. Okay. All right, so let's talk about the Phoenician civilization. It may date back as far as 3000 BC. We're not absolutely positive, but it could go all the way back to the Sumerians. We have pretty much what we consider proof of at least 1200 BC. And here's the general area of where the Phoenician civilization had settlements. Okay, so you're in that Fertile Crescent still. Israel, if you remember that from Jericho, and Syria had Aleppo, so you're still in that same vicinity. And here is a map of their trade route. So these guys were actually on ships. Now I showed you where they live, but they didn't really live there a lot. They traded more than anything else, and their trade was super unique in that they had a certain set of goods that they would routinely, boy, I cannot talk. I feel like I have peanut butter in my mouth. Anyway, they would routinely trade with certain people. So here's how it worked. They would leave their home with their ship full of goods that they're going to give to somebody else. And they would land in the first port, maybe somewhere in Africa or somewhere in Greece, and they would offload, put on the beach, whatever goods they thought that group of people might appreciate. And in exchange, these people knew that they were coming. In exchange, the people would have left things behind for the Phoenicians. If the Phoenicians accepted the trade, they would take the goods that the citizens had left behind and leave their stuff. Okay, so they do a whole path. They have this marked out trading path. They go all the way through it, and then they come back again. If the people didn't like the goods they left behind, then the people would leave them on the shore, and the Phoenicians would leave something different until the people approved of it. So it was this barter system, but you didn't actually have to be there to barter. They just left the stuff on the beach, and the citizens left stuff for them, and trade was done that way. So they started to really learn who liked what and got pretty good at it. But look how many different people they came in contact with. They went all the way up to what we now call Britain. And Paris and Spain. And so the Phoenicians knew a lot of different type of people very, very well, and they knew the waters very well. Makes them super unique. They didn't have this small vision of the world. They had a much more expanded vision than most people of this time period. So their contributions of the Phoenicians, we've already talked about that very unique way of trading. That's one of the big ones. Okay, and another one is the fact that they were the greatest traders in the world at this time period. They were not farmers because the area that they settled in it was more mountainous. I know it's still in the Fertile Crescent, but the area they settled in right against the shoreline just wasn't conducive to constant farming. It was much more rocky than the area where the Sumerians and the Babylonians and all the others centered. So it just wasn't conducive to great farmland right there. Even though the soil was good, there were other things that kept them from farming. They couldn't control the seas of the Mediterranean from flooding. It just wasn't going to happen. So they will become the first group that we know of that had a regular trade route, and that's all they did. They were the first real continuous traders with a set path all the way over into Northern Europe. So makes them very different than any other group of people that we've seen. They also created a very unique boat. So their boats were, you had lots of men in the bow of the boat, and they're all rowing. This is the first time that we have a boat that is run by that kind of manpower, that much manpower. They also created this beautiful sail. So you knew when they were coming, and you knew that it was time to go put your goods on the beach, and then to come back later because there would be new goods on the beach that you might want. So they made their ships very easily identifiable so that you knew that they were coming. It's like a sales pitch. Hey, the Phoenicians are coming, we got to get down to the beach. They also gave us glass for the first time. So they used the sand of the beaches where they had their homes, and they figured out how to make glass out of sand to melt it and turn it into glass. It's pretty unique. Now, it's not the glass that we think of where, you can look out your window and you can see the world as it is. Their glass was much muddier, had a lot of flaws in it, but it was glass. And so it's a brand new thing on the planet. The men were the fashion divas, and it was men that decided to start decorating themselves. So men braided their hair, they put on makeup, they took shells and made that as jewelry and decorated their hair that way. And so we think that the Phoenicians were the first ones to really decorate themselves, and it was the men, not the women. And they wore beautiful gowns. Yeah, the guys were beautiful. They were also known as the Purple People, and this was the women's job. The women actually dove into the waters of the Mediterranean and looked for these snails. And these certain type of snails, when you kill them, they excrete this color purple. And then you can, if you get enough of them, and it's hard to do it, it's very expensive. But if you get enough of them, you can dye material this beautiful purple color and sell it for a whole lot of money. So in this time period, all the way through the Roman Empire, you knew somebody was super rich if you saw them wearing purple. The emperors and empresses always wore purple. It was a sign of power and influence because you could afford the Phoenician purple. So they're the ones that gave us that color in clothing. Pretty fantastic, right? All right. But probably the most influential thing that they gave us was a brand new alphabet. So they came up with the Phoenician alphabet, which is the basis for Western alphabets, our alphabet. Okay, so let me show you the differences between the alphabets through time. So here you have the Phoenicians, and then the Phoenician became Greek, and then the Greek became what we have today in English. So you can see the similarities, and some of them are just uncanny. Some of them, all we did, like the letter E, was just flip it around. So it definitely is the foundation for our present day English alphabet. So the Phoenicians are going to exchange these ideas ideas that they gather from one group to another, and they really do change the life of everybody that they come in contact with by sharing these ideas. But eventually, sharing these ideas had other people trading like they did and creating regular trading routines, and so eventually these guys are going to decide that they want to just move and be farmers instead of going through the trouble of visiting all these foreign lands, and so they leave. Well, there are two groups there when the Phoenicians leave: the Philistines of Palestine and the Hebrews of Israel. And these guys began what we call Israel today. So in Palestine, you've got the Philistines and the Hebrews who were fighting over the territory, who gets it, and they still do not get along today. Let's take a little sidestep here, and I want to talk for a minute about the Torah, which is the Jewish holy book, and the Bible, which is the Christian holy book. They share some books, and they both talk about the Garden of Eden, and they both talk about that garden having four rivers. And the only place on the planet that we can find where four rivers merged is in Iraq. So two of those rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, are still there. The other two, you can find the riverbeds if you're looking for them, but they dried up long ago because of just storms and earthquakes and things like that. Probably it changed the direction of the rivers and they dried up. So this is the only place on earth that we can find those four rivers in one place where they actually converge with one another. So if there was a Garden of Eden, it probably existed in what we now know as Iraq. So that should give you an idea of how fertile this place is and why people would be fighting over land if one group leaves. The groups that are still there, of course they want it. So how do the Hebrews get to where the Phoenicians were. Okay, so we talked about Abraham was born in the city of Ur, which was a Sumerian city. It was not near the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, but in 2100 BC, God came to Abraham and told him to move his people towards the Mediterranean, to an area that he called Canaan. Today we know it as Israel. Okay, so the Hebrews are traveling to Canaan, the ancient city for Israel, and he is picking up people along the way. He's trying to spread his faith and bring people with him to create a civilization when he gets to the Mediterranean. Now, this is before the Phoenicians have moved out or anything, okay? This is early on. So think of how brave this man was. He was one monotheistic man among a multitude of polytheistic people. He's lucky that he didn't get killed a million times over. So you got to admit that he's pretty brave to do what he's doing. All right, so you can see here that he has made his city. When he gets to Canaan, that's the location. Okay, it's in the same territory as the Phoenicians that I showed you. So they are more in the southern section, Canaan is. And then you have a group called the Palestinians who are, today we would know them as Muslims, and they are to the north, with the Phoenicians kind of mingled in amongst them all. Okay, but the Phoenicians got the worst part of the land, yes, so they moved on to more fertile lands, but it's still empty land when they leave, and so the Canaanites and the Palestinians are going to fight over it. All right, so what happens in 1700 BC that's going to change everything? Abraham's grandson was named Jacob, and he had 12 sons. And in 1700 BC, he was forced to leave Canaan forever because there was a famine. The crops were not growing at all. It was just a really, really bad couple of years, and people were starting to starve. So Jacob got together with his 12 sons and they decided on a plan that they would actually go to Egypt. They had been trading with the Egyptians for many years, and they really felt like that was a place where they could find refuge until things got better in Canaan, where they currently lived. So they left. Okay, that's pretty significant. They left. All right, so what happens to them? They are not taken in as, like friends of the citizens of Egypt. They are enslaved when they get there, and they're enslaved for 400 years. So there is an Egyptian pharaoh that by the name of Ramses II, and we'll get to him when we talk about Egypt. But Ramses II, we're not actually sure if he's the guy who enslaved them or if he's the one that set them free. But Ramses II has something to do with it. And again, we'll talk more about him when we get to Egypt. But the fact remains that the Hebrews are enslaved, and so they are gone from the city of Canaan for 400 years. Okay, Moses comes along, and I'm not going to get into the story of Moses, but Moses comes along and leads an exodus out of Egypt. He takes his Hebrews and does a mass departure or an exodus, and he's going to lead his people home back to Canaan after 400 years. Along the way, he's going to stop at a place called Mount Sinai. And according to the Bible, he climbed this mountain, and at the top, he spoke to God, and God handed him the 10 Commandments, which is the moral code for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So it's 10 rules to live by, the moral code of all three of these religions. So that Exodus not only freed the Hebrews from Egyptian enslavement, it also created the moral code by which the majority of the world lives their lives right now. So Abraham is rightly called the father of these three faiths because all of this started with him. If he had never taken his people to Canaan and started a city, if he had never decided or if Jacob had never decided that they should leave and go to Egypt, they never would have found the 10 Commandments. So all of this goes all back to Abraham. So he is considered the father of all three faiths. So they return to Canaan and they create the kingdom of Israel. Well, the Palestinians or Philistines, whichever one you want to call them, same thing, are really upset. They're like, "Hey, you've been gone for 400 years. Did you really think that we were going to save the land for you? Do you not remember fighting before you left after the Phoenicians left? Come on, what is wrong with you?" But the Hebrews said, "You can't take this land. God gave it to us. We get it if we can't take the Phoenician land over because that wasn't, given to us by God. But Canaan was given to us by God. Nobody can take that away." And of course, the Palestinians are not going to agree with that. And so even today, they're still killing each other over the argument of who owns this land and who has a more of a right to it. All right, so here's what I want you to do. You need to either write this chart down, or I may have given you something that you can fill in. Somehow, some way, you need to know this chart. I don't care so much about years, but I do want you to know the order that we do the Sumerians to the Babylonians, Hittites, Assyrians, Babylonians again, and then the Persians. I want you to know where the Hebrews are, what peoples they may have met, and the Phoenicians as well. Okay, so Phoenicians are done trading before the Assyrians come along, but the Hebrews are still around. So I want you to you need to know who is neighbors to who and who came before and after who. Okay, not as complicated as it sounds, so don't let it intimidate you. All right, so that is it for this unit. The Fertile Crescent, we've done as much as we can possibly do, but I do want you to take a really good look at the map here. So you see where Sumer is and where is right there on the Persian Gulf. Remember where Canaan and Palestine are, that the Abraham marched his people all the way across there to get to the promised land. And you can see all these other places that we've talked about too, Tigris and Euphrates River. There's Jericho in there, the Dead Sea, if you ever wondered where that was. So hopefully this map is going to kind of give you an idea of what we're talking about. See the Hittites over there, and they moved in to take over Sumer, the city of Assyria. So you can kind of see where all these people were before they came in and started taking over one another. Okay, so hopefully you are not too confused. I promised Egypt is next, and it's going to be a whole lot quicker and a whole lot less complicated. So I just felt like we should start with the most complicated and work down from there. So if you get Mesopotamia with all these crazy characters involved, you can do anything. Okay, all right, see you in the next unit.